I think we all have some additional questions, but let's get to the last group of speakers representing the Association for the Improvement of American Infrastructure. We have Joseph Aiello, Chair of Fiscal and Management Control Board at MBTA, and John Parkinson, Executive Director of AIAI. I'll let you speak as in the order and sequence that you prefer.
Thank you. We're actually
supposed to avoid this in
right,
P3s, I thought.
That's one of those symbols we want to try and avoid at all costs. What we thought we might do is take a couple of minutes to share the perspective of someone who has experienced a lot of the exposure to risk and had an opportunity to introduce some of those innovative and creative solutions to some of those challenges, and in fact has faced head-on abruptly, perhaps better put, some of the political risk issues that have that have been brought to bear in recent enough transactions that they're very real world. As Joe will get ready to speak, I wanted to chime in a quick point that John and Chris were just talking to about about the 50%. P3s canceled and otherwise. If you look at it from the right lens, you can certainly make those numbers work. Projects that might be considered as a candidate for a public-private partnership, certainly you would include in that. And so when a decision is made along the procurement path, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and emphasize some of the points that John had raised earlier, those all count in that metric. So if you've gotten to a point that you've decided it's not in the best interest of the public to pursue this as an alternative delivery method, that would count in the metric there of the 50%, that will have been canceled. Don't want to scare anybody into thinking there's a fiscal close, a financial close, a commercial close, and there's shovels in the dirt, and now the P3s start getting canceled at that rate. I just wanted to clarify that so as to avoid that misperception, because Mr. Coffey, I think along the lines of what you said, all procurements are subject to that across a broad range of sectors. P3s are not unique to that. That's why it's so important, and you'll hear this emphasized again shortly, the old adage of best to measure twice, cut once. Carpenters have been living by that for a very long time, and it's critical in this environment because the stakes are so high, because the rewards are so high, but invariably the risks are there, and there's a lot of hand-holding, not hand-wringing, on addressing those risks, and that's why P3s make so much sense. So just wanted to raise that point. And on the transition topic of risk, if we ask a AIAI member, Joe Aiello and Meridiam, to address that in your perspective from the public sector as well.
Sure. So I'm formally here as a partner at Meridiam Infrastructure. We raise a series of private equity funds to invest in public infrastructure. I'm happy to talk about my work at the MBTA, but that's not particularly why I'm here. I might follow up on a couple of topics here with respect to risk, and I think there were perhaps a few points I might want to emphasize from our colleagues. My colleagues here. One is certainly the role of legislative bodies. And I think if you were to look around the country and determine best practices, it's important for legislative bodies to weigh in and set the regulations and set the tone and set the standards about what will make an acceptable PPP. But it is fairly deadly if you want to look at cancellations. It's a fairly deadly disease when the legislative body is allowed to approve the deal at the back end. And it's really something, not that legislative bodies inherently are evil people, right? They're not, but they've changed people. So while you have a governor that typically has 4 years, and in the first year of that governor's term, they began a procurement process. These procurement processes typically last around 3 years. It's quite frequent that every 2 years you have a different set of folks chairing a variety of committees in the legislative houses. And so you have completely different folks there that didn't know the deal in the first place and may have a pretty wildly different view. So I think in terms of best practices, what we observe is the the need for the legislature to weigh in on the law, to weigh in on the promulgation of regulations, and to pre-approve other criteria in advance at which projects need to demonstrate that they meet that criteria, but try to avoid a legislative blessing at the back end. The other lesson, I think, in terms of failure, and then I'll explain sort of who Meridiam is, but I thought I'd just jump in given the time, is the use of P3 is not an excuse for the government to walk away from its obligation to protect the public interest, right? And that's another thing that we see when projects fail. Oh, I've got a P3, let's just give it to some private enterprise. You live, and we all live, in a political world with multiple complicated stakeholder groups, with complicated regulatory and financial environments. And I think Chris said it, communicating with them about how you're doing this project as if it was a normal project is still the best practice obligation of the government. That should not be transferred onto the private sector. I think John was talking about even the fine-grained issue of tolling. You may decide to toll a facility so you can raise some revenue, but you can make a second separate decision to say, we, the government, want to retain the collection of the tolls and the toll risk because of a variety of reasons, which may be that despite your best efforts of communicating and showing documentation to the contrary, the public just doesn't trust having the tolls in the hands of the private sector, whether it's privacy concerns or concerns about the ability to sneak in rate increases that nobody can figure out. None of those are true, by the way. But so there are a whole series of fine-grained decisions that you all need to make, and frequently when we see these projects bubble up and hiccup, or whatever term you want to use, is because there has been an abdication of the public sector's responsibility in other jurisdictions. So just a couple of cautions. Just a bit about Meridiam, and then I really will be very brief here. We're about a 12-year-old firm. We are a private equity firm that came into the market with a very different view about public-private partnerships, and that is that we decided we wanted our limited partners, who are typically public pension funds, insurance companies. We have the Lumberjacks of British Columbia Pension Fund as an example in our funds. We wanted to have them be aligned with the long-term interests of our government counterparties and the long-lived nature of the assets. So we came into the market asking our limited partners to be in for 25 years. So it's a radically different approach because it allows us to say, and I'm not just talking about Meridiam anymore, I think the entire private equity world that operates in this business, to be able to say to you, the counterparty, we're going to be here today at the beginning while we are making our proposal, but we're going to be here at the back end when it's time to turn the facility back to you. So that, I think, is a very different change in the market that has been than what has been in existence prior to sort of 10 years ago. Paul Padini showed you that terrific graphic. I'm going to jump around just a little bit and skip some of my other remarks about the LaGuardia terminal. It's important to note the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey did an extraordinary job of building the case for why people should come and invest in that very large, complicated project in a very difficult town to do work with an authority that had a sort of a legacy of doing things a bit odd. They spent a great deal of time on it. They got great competition. The end result that came really from the Skanska team was marvelous. New York Port Authority had spent 20 years trying to figure out how to replace the central terminal. They had hired the best planners, designers, architects to come up with a variety of schemes. In fact, I wrote it down, they had paid for 27 different schemes over that period of time. The technical solution, which was driven by you must keep all the gates in operation, you must keep the traffic moving, and you've got to build back something that meets operating costs, construction costs, competitive features that they built into the deal, and it's something where we are going to take market risk on the ability to sell retail goods to the customers in there, as well as some of the passenger employment fees. we came back with a schematic that nobody had thought about. And the only reason we really came with that schematic is because we were driven to compete with two other international organizations, right? And if we hadn't, it wasn't that our architects were any smarter, but you put the architects and the contractor and the operator and the financer in the same room and you say, gee, there's two other teams trying to outthink us, it really provides enormous value to the client. Can point to other projects, the Elizabeth River Crossing, Port of Miami Tunnel. The government thought it was going to be a $1.2 billion rock construction project. 2 to 3 bidders. We were the successful bidder on that. Came in at under $700 million because they were allowed to innovate. They had a broad set of environmental restrictions about tunneling under Biscayne Bay, but that the technical firms were allowed to think about meeting the goals of where the tunnel would come up on either end, but a little bit of guidance to be able to innovate about how that tunnel was going to be developed, and it developed enormous cost savings. Can't overemphasize the obligation to communicate. It's across the board. There's a phrase that I think could be applied to other things, but change with uncertainty is deadly, right? Change everybody thinks is a great thing, but we don't explain what the change is going to be. It allows people to think about what that change represents for them. They're always going to come to the worst conclusions. And you're going to think about small businesses, small contractors, middle-sized contractors, local engineers, architects, suppliers, your public workforce. What does it mean for me? Have I given up, and is the public thinking, am I giving up control of these assets to the private sector? If done right, and John will tell you, a PPP gives the public and the taxpayer greater control over short and long-term private sector performance than in a traditional procurement. And the reason is the leverage over the fact that I have my money in the deal and Skanska has their money in the deal, and if we don't perform day after day for the next 35 years, you don't pay us or you penalize us, right? There's no other kind of procurement arrangement between the public sector and the private sector that gives you that kind of leverage, and so therefore something to consider. The last is, this is not a one-size-fits-all business. PPP will not be the answer to all of your dreams and expectations. It will have limited application to your projects, as Chris described. But it is an important tool, and if used for selective projects, can really provide great outcomes for customers and great outcomes for taxpayers. I'll go to John.
Great. Thank you, Joe. So as we're going through a little bit of the fundamentals of P3s, you'll see in the slide deck provided to you a little summary of a lot of what has been talked about across a range, both from a legal perspective and the practical implementation. And so I think it's important to be able to highlight a little bit about what a P3 is, and I think each of the speakers thus far has talked through that. It's important to understand that a P3 is not appropriate for every project. I think the 10 to 15% metric that Chris shared, and Joe, his description just now, really highlighting that it's important to understand when you're applying the right tool for the right reason. It's not simply a matter of going out there and finding, this can work. I wasn't able to do it before, so let me try this way instead. That's a big part of what the pre-screening process is really all about, and understanding what the needs are, the outcomes, the anticipated outcomes, the expected performance at the end of the design and construction phase, and getting to that operations and maintenance phase is a big part of that, and communication and transparency are the underlying components of that. It's equally as important to highlight what a P3 is not. Most importantly is the early slide that John shared in terms of the structure. One of the fence poles there, is about privatization. The most important thing to reemphasize about what a P3 provides is public sector control It's all about the public interest. If we're talking about building something that shouldn't be built because it doesn't address a legitimate need that wouldn't rise to a level of priority to get a responsible government agency to make a decision, to commit the resources, time and money, then the private sector is not really all that interested in it either, because that's going to be more subjected to the political forces, to the changes in in priorities down the road. It's the adage about about deferred maintenance. If you defer it long enough, it becomes a capital replacement program. That's not what a P3 is designed to address. It's designed to be able to address this in as responsible a way as possible. And so it's important to understand, that component about privatization, that control issue that Joe just mentioned. And then the other piece is, beyond it not being privatization, it's also not a source of funding. It's a common misperception that, when you talk about, here, I don't have enough money to build this project, so let's do a P3. That's not what this is about. And be remiss if I didn't, highlight that as a point of emphasis, because it really does, the notion of, if we don't have the money for this, if we've not identified, a pay-as-you-go, strategy, it doesn't have the ability to generate the revenue to allow you to offset the cost it would take to design it, to build it, and then downstream, to be able to operate it and maintain it. You can't identify those, the source of funds to do that, then you wonder whether it's a high enough priority compared to the other things that you're having to take on. And so that's a big part of that. So we talked quickly about the benefits of P3s, and there are lots of them. But the slide here that is designed to capture some of the attributes that are used to describe it. These could be used to measure or to evaluate any procurement method, quite frankly. But we highlight these as components of the benefits of public-private partnerships, and these are indeed the attributes that we use to evaluate best practices for procurement methods for a legislative framework going forward. And I'll talk about that here in just a moment. But the idea is to be able to convey what the value proposition of this procurement is. You're trying to get to to that end goal of meeting a public need, and to doing that in the most responsible way in the public interest. And these are the attributes that we look to highlight, as specific to public-private partnerships. So a quick thought here about the assets. You saw a slide similar to this before, but one of the charters we understand about the commission is to evaluate what the eligibility for or the applicability of different product types, to use a real estate term, or to the different infrastructure sectors, so that this is not just, for the last couple of days at AASHTO, this is not just roads, bridges, and tunnels to toll or not to toll. Right? There's a lot more to public infrastructure, and the sectors that are identified here, the 9 categories of them, and 3 examples of each of those, are designed to help broaden the perspective. And I think this goes back to an early point that John made, and that is, if you're designing a program, you should design it with something other than this 12-mile stretch or this 21.4-mile widening and capacity expansion in mind. It really ought to be with the broader infrastructure needs of the state of Rhode Island, taken into consideration. And if it's a procurement tool in the toolbox, drawing on that metaphor again, it could be applied to something other than just a road, bridge, or a tunnel, as has been the case, as a broad category. There's lots of other ways to do that. We have examples of social infrastructure across the country where that has been successfully applied, and we think that's something that ought to be considered as from our perspective. It's a best practice to allow that. Whether or not that hammer, that procurement tool or method, gets applied to an aggregation of schools, a number of schools that might be modernized, or to a water treatment, a group of water treatment facilities, whether that's the case or not, isn't as material as you've got the flexibility to do that. So when the circumstance presents itself, you've established a forward-thinking framework to allow that. This does get around to the notion of, once you've seen one P3, you've seen one P3. We have a number of our board of directors members who have said that in the past, and it really does strike at at the notion of understanding how best to approach the whole procurement process and the framework that you're operating within. It's easy to describe as the slide conveys, a typical P3 process, but when you get right down to it, the difference between approaching this as a revenue risk transportation, heavy civil project is going to be a little bit different than a people-centered, transit-oriented development opportunity that's really about a foundation for other revenue sources, other tax revenue that may come from real estate development around a station for a mass transit, stop as an example, or the retail opportunities available through a modernized central terminal building at a previously thought of as a third world airport, at least as it had been described sort of infamously or famously. The idea is to build upon that and see what other opportunities there are. So again, once you've seen one P3, you've seen one P3. It takes a lot of time to work your way through it and to think it through in the process. And that's why, we commend you for having this commission to understand what those possibilities, will be. Because no one wants to be sold a procurement method for a particular project. You want to be able to establish a framework that will allow you to work your way through that. This is where I go back to the adage I referred to earlier. The carpenter, famously, better to measure twice and cut once. The failed projects, how long a project's overdue or how far over budget it is for the people who have approached it in the past with the other dynamic in mind. Even some of the projects that you have here in town, there's big signs that tell you where you are in terms of schedule discipline and budget certainty. That's a level of transparency and communication from the public to the or public sector to the end user that's not typical, but is a welcome step. You've already got some of the seeds planted that will allow P3s to work in Rhode Island. I referred to this a little bit earlier. One of the ways that we've come across, I think each of you have a copy of the best practices guide, and this matches up nicely with the information that I know the evaluations that have taken place through the National Council for Public-Private Partnerships and with the Association for the Improvement of American Infrastructure. A number of other entities around the globe have contributed their thoughts on what best practices are. We approach this and the recommendations that are made by AIAI in testimony like this, as well as other educational opportunities, are drawn from what other people have gone through before. In some cases, they've suffered through them. In some cases, they've helped them identify new, creative, innovative ways to get through a project. So our best practices are based on our best practices recommendations are based on an analytic framework that takes into consideration the other states that have P3 enabling legislation, those that have practiced and procured projects through that, because not all those that have P3 authority have exercised that authority. And that's drawn from more than just the U.S. We started out by looking to our neighbor to the north and evaluating some of what they've been able to do. I know that law firms have done that. The legal advisors, technical and financial advisors have also engaged, in that, and they have experience in both. And so we've drawn upon that, both global best practices, North American, and specifically, through Infrastructure Ontario, through partnerships, BC, British Columbia, and that's been a big part of helping to inform the process. And then the practical experience of our member companies and those who aren't member companies but are leaders in the industry or practitioners of public-private partnerships. And it's important for us at least to be able to identify that. A couple of quick notes on some of the resources that are available to you, and I know NCPPP has some of these available as well. And it's important to know that there are resources out there, not only for the Commission, but also for legislators. In all the excitement of last Tuesday, one of the important things for us to note, the one policy issue that got addressed, in the victory or acceptance speech by President-elect Trump, was infrastructure. One of the things that's exciting for us to understand in the context of the slide that you see here is that there are 7 new senators coming into the upper chamber of Congress. There are 55 new members of the House of Representatives. A little uncertain just yet what their understanding of the policy framework that will contribute to how to execute on the vision or the plans for investment in, in public infrastructure. That's one of the reasons why we draw upon educational resources, our partners at NCPPP, our member companies, and elsewhere, to be able to help share, what some of that will be. And so that's one of the examples, at the federal level, so too with each state as you newly enable public-private partnerships as a procurement method. We look to offer, program, it's direct education. It's a P3 direct program, as you see here. There's workshops, there's roundtables, there's lots of opportunity to go and hear from others what they've experienced or suffered through, depending on their perspective, so as to know how best to prepare and establish a framework that will make for the best possible outcome going forward when you indeed engage in that. And we draw members of AIAI into that, and these, as often as not, the Public-Private Partnership Conference, which is an annual event, as many public sector entities are represented there, and public officials are in attendance there. They're there to learn. They're there to share their experiences and best practices with their colleagues, and it's all part of the communications process. I think we've all hit on communication as a fundamental ingredient, going forward, and I think it's critical to be able to do that. So, I'll close with that and let you know that, again, we applaud the notion of the Commission looking into what makes sense, what works, what are the best practices going forward, so as to position Rhode Island to be the best stewards of the public investments in infrastructure going forward.